My name is John Benet Ramsey, and I'm 5.5.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. This is episode 10 in the Carnes Order series, where Carnes sings the praises of Lou Smith's intruder suspects, including Santa Claus. I'm doing this a little bit out of order. The section that we're actually going into is to do with publicity around the crime. I'll be dealing with what she says about that. Frankly, it's just, I don't know, it just doesn't make much sense, the way that she talks about people profiting from the case from quite a sort of one-sided perspective. But we're going to deal with that in the next episode, number 11. So in this episode, we will look at how Carnes basically justifies not only the intruder theory, but starts to look at the list of suspects, not only suggested by Lou Smith, but actually published in the Ramseys book. Before we get to that, thank you for the 100 or so people who've subscribed to the channel in the last day. If you haven't subscribed, click on the light blue icon on the bottom right. Like, share, leave a comment. And let's get started. So we're on page 29 of the 93 page Carnes order. We're around about a third of the way through, and at this point the judge highlights 5 people, including the plaintiff in this case, Chris Wolf, who should be further investigated. Now, what's interesting in the Carnes order is it refers to the Ramseys book as with the following title: The Death of Innocence, the Untold Story of John Benet's Murder and How Its Exploitation Compromised the Pursuit of Truth. Now, I've got the book right in front of me, and it doesn't say anything about that. The book in front of me says, The Death of Innocence, John Benet's Parents Tell Their Story. It's quite a mouthful though, isn't it? The Death of Innocence, the Untold Story of John Benet's Murder and How Its Exploitation Compromised the Pursuit of Truth. And it's so ironic. Didn't the ransom note compromise the pursuit of truth? Didn't Alex Hunter, by not pursuing those those votes that were voted by the grand jury, didn't that compromise the pursuit of truth? Didn't the lack of cooperation, just in terms of the timing of the Ramseys talking to the police, didn't that compromise the pursuit of truth? And something that I thought about recently is, if you think about a scenario where John Benet had died, and then the pageantry around that, specifically regarding the duct tape. So John Benet has died, putting the duct tape over her mouth. It is symbolically saying that we are going to try to compromise the pursuit of truth. And in a weird way, it's almost like shutting the mouth of a child who can't speak anyway because she's died, but shutting her mouth and thereby misrepresenting what really happened to her. And isn't that what happened? The other thing with the duct tape is it is an analogy for silence. In other words, and you see it sometimes with protesters today. They will put tape over their own mouths, sometimes a cross on the tape, to represent how they have been silenced, how they are not listened to. And in a scenario here where a family member may have done that, she's already been silenced, and now the duct tape is basically even more emblematic of that. It's quite crazy. And then the Ramseys represent themselves in their own book called The Death of Innocence, and they say it's the untold story. I'm not sure how much of it wasn't told, because they were on CNN within a week. They would then go on CNN again to market their book. They were in the media constantly, and still are. And you had a similar feeling in Amanda Knox's book, Waiting to be Heard, the sense that she's waiting to tell her story because she hasn't told it yet. And yet, in terms of the police, she told her story over and over again. The same with the Ramseys. The Ramseys spoke at length to the police, but it's an untold story. I suppose you could say, well, from the public's perspective. On the other hand, you could say, well, wasn't a story put out there by public relations? And so what's interesting is the Ramseys say, according to Judge Carnes on page 29, that defendants assert that they wrote their book in response to media speculation that they were involved in their child's murder and to correct inaccurate data, media reports, right? So their statement is basically here that everybody else tried to profit out of John Bonet's death, but no. What we did was was in response to media speculation. So if there hadn't been much media speculation, they wouldn't have written the book, and they were trying to correct inaccurate data that implicated them. Right? Chris Wolf, the plaintiff, on the other hand, was saying that the defendant's book was authored to attempt to escape prosecution for the murder of John Bonet. Bear in mind, their book came out in 2000, and the grand jury voted to indict the Ramseys in 1999, but then nobody knew that. So if anything, the Ramseys book was and it came out very, very shortly after the grand jury voted. If you think about that, it's actually quite crazy. It came out very soon afterwards, and basically I get the idea that it was to cement in the mind of the public that the Ramseys had a good story exonerating themselves. According to Judge Carnes, the book sets forth the defendant's account of the investigation of their daughter's murder and their view that the police did not adequately investigate several leads. So it's basically to justify themselves and to criticize the police. Now, I've got The Death of Innocence with me. I've gone through it with a fine-tooth comb, and I find it fascinating things that are the way that the book is constructed, the way that certain things are represented. It's obviously a perfect Christmas. Just on I think the first page, midway through the first page, it refers to the previous year Burke going to bed at the normal time. I've just highlighted so many things almost on every single page. As early as page 14, this is something I brought up before, where there's a bit of narrative referring to remembering Burke asleep in his bedroom and waking Burke up as gently as possible and all that kind of thing. And subsequently Burke went on to Dr. Fuller and he said, I wasn't sleeping. Right, I was awake, not only awake then, but he was also awake earlier in the evening, meaning when sounds as though almost when everyone was asleep, he was playing with his toy downstairs in the lounge or something like that. So you have this story that is ostensibly written to address matters of accuracy, and then you've got to wonder what is actually accurate in the book. And I think foremost among those things are the suspects, quote unquote, suspects that the Ramseys themselves list. And it says in the Carnes order, quote, in the book, defendants promote the theory that an unknown intruder entered their home and murdered their daughter. Defendants state they believed when writing the book and believe now that the statements contained in the book represent either truthful fact or sincere opinion. The defendant's book names 5 people, including the plaintiff, that's Chris Wolf, whom defendants contend should be further investigated. For example, one lead mentioned is Michael Helgoth, a man who committed suicide 2 months after the murder and 1 day after District Attorney Hunter issued a statement that the authorities were narrowing their search for the murder of John Bonet Ramsey. Now, let me deal with Michael Helgoth briefly. I don't really like dealing with their suspects because that's exactly what they want you to do. They want you to spend your time investigating other people. But I do think it's important to debunk them quickly and effectively. So as soon as you want to talk about Michael Helgoth, you've got to talk really about two things. The one is the fact that he owned high-tech boots, and of course the Ramseys will claim that they didn't, and yet it did come to light later on through the grand jury, through sort of a strange confluence of events, but it came to light that someone did own high-tech boots in the Ramsey home, and also friends of the Ramseys, like I think Fleet White's son and possibly Doug Stein, also owned high-tech shoes. They were all the rage at that time, by the way, especially amongst youngsters and probably amongst Boy Scouts as well. But the point is, Michael Helgoth owned high-tech boots, and then he also had a stun gun. And of course, the stun gun was Lou Smith's pet theory, and there's a lot of intrigue around when this theory came to light. Well, one of the ways to investigate it, they felt they needed to exhume JonBenét's body and check the marks on her back, examine those in order to fully investigate that. And that was really going to be at the discretion. They needed the permission of the parents to do that. And so you had a lot of talk about they're going to exhume the body in order to prove this, and then guess what happened? They never exhumed the body. And so that myth has persisted ever since, that there's a stun gun involved, and none of that makes any sense either. The loudness of the stun gun, I was speaking to someone about it recently, and anyway, the other thing about the stun gun, and it's something Kolar emphasizes, is the width of the copper points of contact just don't match the width of the abrasions on JonBenét's back. Besides all that, it makes a loud noise, and it is likely to cause someone to cry out rather than to subdue them. It's certainly not going to render you unconscious. It might render you to some extent immobile or paralyzed, but there are much easier ways to subdue a child, than stun gunning them. You can just, anyway. So the whole Michael Helgoth thing is a great dead end, because how do you investigate someone who's no longer alive? It's a great way to go. It's definitely this guy, but since he's died, we'll never know. But basically, if you believe in the stun gun, then Michael Helgoth really stands out as your likeliest suspect, which is why Carnes mentions him first. And then this is what Carnes says about it, quote, "Indeed, a stun gun was found near Mr. Helgoth's body, as well as boots with a high-tech logo like that left on the basement floor of the defendant's home." And that's all. That's really all they say about Helgoth. Quite a simple thing is, where was he on the night in question? Is there anything on his computer that would link him? Anyway, all of that is doing exactly what the Ramseys want you to do, which is, let's think about somebody else, right? If you really wanted to do it, you could do it. You could spend days, weeks, or months thinking about Helgoth, but then you would need to really get to know him really well, and you'd need to get to know his circumstances. And was there depression in his life? Was there all those things? And what other reason could there be for him being suicidal? And I think you'd find one. So then it goes from there to another lead mentioned is Gary Oliver. Now, this is the game that has been played in the Ramsey case since 2000, which is you jump onto one suspect. I think it could be Michael Helgoth, and then you focus on him, and then you get really caught up in it, and then it sort of ends off with uncertainty. We couldn't establish for sure that it was him, but actually it could actually be this guy, and then it's Gary Oliver, right? And then it's the same thing all over again. You go through it. These are the circumstances that make it seem like it could be him. You get to almost the conclusion, but then there's a problem. Oh, but don't worry, it could actually be this guy. And that has been going on for the past 25 years, essentially, maybe 20 years. Now, the interesting thing is, in the Madeleine McCann case, you have exactly the same thing happening. It's also a scenario where something happened to a child, a little girl. The parents were suspects. They claimed they weren't suspects. They wanted the police to investigate other people. They kept giving the police, not orders, but basically clues or instructions: investigate this guy, investigate this person, investigate that person. And anyone that the police don't investigate, the police are wrongly fixating on us, kind of thing. And then every year at around about the time of the Madeleine McCann anniversary, you seem to have another suspect, quote unquote suspect, that is sort of paraded through the media. And then everyone gets very excited, and the media print a lot of headlines, and then it fizzles. And that goes on year after year after year. And what that achieves at the end of the day is a narrative that somebody else is responsible. No one is ever identified. There's never a trial. There are never charges. But don't worry, there'll be another suspect next year. And that satisfies that appetite for, well, it's not the parents, it's somebody. It doesn't matter that it's really nobody or nobody specific. It's just somebody besides them that must be responsible. And I did a video recently on the McCanns, on the suspect, that the latest suspect. I'll put a link to that in the description. But someone who, there's been this almost arrogant sense that it's definitely this guy, and almost like John Mark Carr. And then after about a year, sorry, there's not going to be a trial, there's not even going to be charges, we're not even going to interrogate the guy. And you just get a sense of how easily the media are manipulated into doing a song and dance that distracts from reality. So at the bottom of page 29, there's Gary Oliva is mentioned, and why is he a suspect? Well, he's a transient, he's got a history of child molestation, and he picked up his mail 1 block from the Ramsey home. So he's now another great suspect. He picked his mail up in the area. Now, what I think you've got to just try to imagine is, you've got an adult male child molester, and then you say, okay, so what did he do to John Bonet? You've got this fully fledged pedophile. What did he do? What did he actually do to John Bonet? And then when you go and look at the autopsy, John Bonet's parents themselves scoffed at the notion that John Bonet was molested in the first place. This was in late April, early May 1997.
There have also been innuendos that she has been or was sexually molested. I can tell you those were the most hurtful innuendos to us as a family. They are totally false. John Bonet and I had a very close relationship.
To my ears, that sounds like a denial that John Bonet has been or was sexually molested. And so it goes from that position in early 1997 to actually there was a full-blown sexual predator who had his way with John Bonet. So you go from there's no evidence, or there's nothing more than vaginitis going on here, to no, it's actually a full-blown sexual assault by an adult, really. And then the adult used a paintbrush. It's a kind of an odd way for someone who's fixated or obsessed and some kind of sick individual to do something. It just seems so indirect. There are no signs of seminal fluid. There's no signs of bruising. There's no obvious signs of sexual assault that you would get in victims of these kinds of crimes. But suddenly it is elevated to that sort of thing. And of course, the fact is the Boulder police did investigate these leads and they dismissed them. I think one of the suspects mentioned in the Ramseys book that exposes the I hate to use this word over and over again, the craziness, basically the circus that is going on is Bill McReynolds, where they actually implicate Bill McReynolds in the whole thing. This guy this really old fellow who had, I think, open heart surgery, and now you've got to imagine Santa Claus literally climbing through that basement window, running around up and down the house, doing all of these circus acts. And what is not going to leave a single strand of his beard is a very hairy fellow. He's not going to leave a single strand of his red Christmas suit or whatever. He's not going to leave Father Christmas boot prints all over the place. He's going to stomp around the house and no one's going to know he's there. And why on earth would Santa need a stun gun? And all of this stuff works wonderfully when you just don't really think about it. When somebody gives you the information and you accept it at face value. And it seems as though the judge in this case did something like that, because she says the Bill McReynolds' wife, I think her name was Janet, she'd written a play about a young girl held captive in a basement whose daughter had been kidnapped and sexually assaulted 22 years to the day before John Bonet's death, and who had written a card to John Bonet that was found in her trash can after the murder. Now, circumstantial evidence like that is pretty weird. It's pretty, I won't say damning, but certainly quite compelling. But then again, you've got to say, well, where's the evidence? And then it refers to another lead identified by Detective Smith was the plaintiff, meaning Chris Wolf. Now, I think one of the most basic ways to look at this, and it's very interesting that it doesn't come up in the Ramseys narrative, and you never really hear about it, is, okay, so we really think that the person responsible is Michael Helgoth. Okay, so Michael Helgoth wrote the ransom note. So it's quite simple. It's a DNA case, and whoever killed John Bonet wrote the ransom note, so it's quite simple. Let us look at the DNA of Michael Helgoth, right? And let us look at the handwriting of Michael Helgoth. And guess what happens? His handwriting doesn't even almost match the ransom note. And also, can you imagine Michael Helgoth using words like attaché and using the language of the ransom note? You know, use your southern common sense. In other words, try and conflate the personality of the ransom note with a chap like Michael Helgoth. And if you just had to hear this guy speak, you would get a sense that he's not very well educated. He probably didn't write the ransom note, or very probably didn't write the ransom note. Well, what about his DNA? Same thing. Then you go to Gary Oliver and you say, okay, so did you take samples of his handwriting? Oh, wow, it doesn't quite match the ransom note. What about his DNA? Oh, it doesn't quite match the ransom note. These are quite quick and easy ways to exclude a suspect, so why are they not applied? And why not, instead of fielding these people as suspects, well, if you've excluded them, then you don't even need to field them as suspects. And what it seems to be is tickling the public's imagination to say, it could be this person, or it could be that person, it could be someone like this, it could be someone like that. And then there's Bill McReynolds. Did his handwriting match? Well, that doesn't really matter. Let's look at his wife who wrote a play. What about his DNA? Actually, it turns out his DNA didn't match. But we're not going to talk about that. And to have a case before trial like this and you're not going to think about these things, to me is a little bit silly. I mean, how can you, as part of your judgment, basically be repeating the accusations, you can even call it scapegoating, of people that are at the center of a trial? I mean, it's literally like someone is put on trial, right? And then in their response they say, but it could actually be that person, or that person, or that person, or that person. And then the judge in her judgment then repeats those things. What's also interesting in the Ramseys book is that they apparently name 8 other leads, quote unquote leads, but they don't name them. So they discuss them, but they don't name them. And I think it's quite clear that right in the beginning, Linda Hoffman Pugh was identified by Patsy as the possible author of the ransom note, as a possible suspect because of money, and she took them to court. And I think another person that they accused was Jeff Merrick, a former employee, and another person that was sort of, I don't know if he was formally accused or just implicated, was Fleet White, and to some extent his wife. But the list of people that were accused is really, really long. And if you want a legitimate suspect, it really needs to be one person. So a good example is in the case of the murder of Travis Alexander. When the police came to investigate, they started asking Travis's friends, who could have done this? And there was sort of a unanimous suspect where no matter who the friend was, they said, I think you need to look into Jodi Arias. There weren't half a dozen names or 5 names or several people. It was basically one person, and it turned out that was that person. For me, it's quite hard to imagine that you are sincere, and this is a word that the judge uses, that the book was written out of all sincerity in their pursuit of the truth, right? It was their sincere opinion. And then you have a situation where so many people, their friends are implicated, their housekeeper is implicated, and then you've got to say, and then it turns out that you can't implicate, for example, the housekeeper because, once again, her handwriting doesn't match and she has an alibi. And then the same thing applies over and over again. And then you've got to sort of wonder, isn't this a case of throwing the pasta up to the ceiling and seeing if it's going to stick? And if you throw enough pasta, some of it's got to stick. And it did. And one of the people it stuck to was Chris Wolf, hence this lawsuit. One thing that I think is of some debatable interest in the book, Chapter 33, this is highlighted by Judge Carnes. She says, quote, defendants present a detailed profile of the murderer. The profile offered is that of a male ex-convict, aged 25 to 35, who is familiar with and owns a stun gun, end quote. Now, when I look at that, I sort of wonder, okay, so how on earth do you accuse someone like Bill McReynolds, who isn't an ex-convict and is not that age, and I don't know if he owns a stun gun. Then you look at the housekeeper, well, she's not male, she's not an ex-convict, she's not of that age, and does she own a stun gun? Same with Fleet White. So they first name all of these suspects, then they say, okay, it's sort of, well, we're looking for this kind of profile, to get you on track. Why not provide that profile right in the beginning and then say, well, these people don't actually match the profile? At the bottom of page 30, she writes, quote, the passage at issue from the Ramsey book that is the heart of the present libel claim criticizes the Boulder Police Department for failing to investigate these possible leads in the murder investigation, end quote. Now, I've often wondered, could a sense of exhaustion be setting in where you might think that the Ramseys have something to disclose all of this time later? Couldn't they wake up one morning and say, you know what, let's set the record straight, let's reveal something that we haven't revealed before, let's talk about the grand jury votes in a very transparent way. And I think the reason why they can't do that and won't do that is these lawsuits. I don't know whether the statute of limitation has expired. I would presume that they have, but I don't know whether legally, if they had to say something like that, if they had to say, okay, sorry, we were wrong about that and that and that, couldn't they open themselves to being sued by some of the original people who sued them, like Chris Wolf? On the other hand, you could also say, whatever the events of the case, perhaps they feel justified that they are ultimately, basically innocent, and so that is why they are fighting for their innocence. Have they won that fight? So the latest in this whole circus about, okay, we're trying to find the actual killer of John Bonet is part of the whole DNA myth. We are now looking for someone who has this DNA profile. And so it's even more sort of vague than the 8 individuals that are mentioned in the book, but without mentioning their names. It's even more anonymous than that. It's, here's a DNA strand, and we need to sort of knock on people's doors throughout the whole world and test people for DNA, and eventually we'll make our way through 7 point something billion people and we'll find John Bonet's killer. I can tell you it's very likely that you do that, you still won't find a match. But then you can say, well, maybe it was Michael Helgoth to begin with. That the reason that we couldn't get him tested is that he died. Oh, is that the reason why? And I love that they want to do it the DNA way and not do it the ransom note way. Why don't you go and check people's handwriting? It's all over the place. It's free to check. Why don't you want to do that maybe? So I'm not going to take it further than that. In the next episode, I'm going to be talking about this thing. I want to illustrate it, which is why I want to spend a bit more time on it, where she talks about the publicity surrounding the case, and as though it is something that compromised the investigation. But if you look at the scenario of the Ramseys, have brought out quite a lot of self-serving documentaries where John himself is interviewed. Another example is Burke and John and Linwood on Dr. Phil. You have a lot of this stuff, and then at the same time that they can criticize the media for turning people against them, but they are actively involved in the media narrative. And you kind of have this perception that the Ramseys were victimized by appearing in the media, but yet they addressed the media, they went to the media on New Year's Day, right? And that is what started this whole thing, is taking the media into their confidence rather than taking the police into their confidence. And it has been playing out in the media ever since. I don't think you can have it both ways. And in fact, I think in a situation like this, like the Chris Watts case, where a case doesn't go to trial, then there is the court of public opinion. And like it or lose it, love it or lump it, you've got a situation where the public do have an opinion. It comes in all shapes and sizes. But it is interesting what the verdict of that public opinion ultimately is, including in this case. So in the next episode, I'm going to be talking more about Carnes' reference to the publicity surrounding the crime. For those interested in the Craven Silence, the first book that I wrote in the series, this was in 2016. We're up to chapter 15 on Patreon. It's on the $5 tier. For those interested in the Chris Watts case, there's quite an interesting bit of evidence that I feel like I've found, and I'll be talking about that in a video later today. Apparently there's going to be a power failure coming up in a couple of hours, so it might delay that video by a little bit. I must also tell you that we at the halfway mark in the Carnes Order series. We had episode 10. There around about 10 remaining. It might be 11, it might be 9, but there about the same amount of episodes to go. They will be available, the complete episodes will be available on Patreon. I'll probably do something like half or a quarter of the episodes as a preview on YouTube. And that'll be on the $2 tier. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.